Just to make sure everyone knows, everyone's in the right room. This is Vídeo University. And this is okay. So we have two presentations. I assume we do questions at the end. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to start off with Kat Mitchell from the University of Derby, speaking on cancel culture, own voices, and self-censorship.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Kat. I'm going to talk today about cancel culture, own voices, and censorship in the place of disabled sensitivity readers in the publishing industry. So concerns about the regulation and authorship of content, including debates around cancel culture and own voices stories, have been growing in recent years. Publishers are grappling with how to make sure their output remains both authentic and resistant to cancellation, particularly in the light of controversies surrounding Kate Punchy and Janine Cummings. Sensitivity readers perform an editorial function, partly to help mitigate these risks. They are employed because they have an experience or identity that the author does not, but which the author is intending to portray in their book, and they look out for content that might be stereotypical or harmful. Called publishing's most polarizing role and moral gatekeepers, the work of sensitivity readers is far from just a fringe editorial concern. Debates surrounding their usefulness encapsulate many of the key issues plaguing the publishing industry today, from questions about representation, diversity, and authorship, to precarious work contracts and emotional labour. Recent edits made to the works of Ian Fleming, Roald Dahl, and Agatha Christie have thrown the role of sensitivity readers further into the limelight, highlighting the need for investigation into their place in the publishing process. Questions surrounding the usefulness of these readers have divided those in the industry. Some see them as akin to subject experts, and others as a symptom of wider cultural wars which are threatening freedom of expression. The question of how and by whom the stories of disabled people get told is important, as depictions of disability in popular culture are likely to impact the treatment of disabled people in everyday life. However, a reliance on marginalised freelancers doing precarious short-term work involving emotional labour for these sensitivity reads, particularly when the industry's workforce is short on in-house disabled employees, may not be a long-term solution. So through a summary of very early initial research, including structured interviews with publishing professionals, this presentation will briefly explore the place and future of disabled sensitivity readers in the industry via three key themes: sensitivity reads as an editorial function, as censorship, and as a workforce issue. Originating in the US, what the industry thinks of today as sensitivity readers initially mostly worked on books aimed at children and young adults, until their use became more widely popularized for books aimed at older readers too. The origins of the term sensitivity reader are hard to pinpoint, but according to Gomez, it is typically attributed to YA author Justina Ireland, who first built a database of people willing to do this work in 2016. Very little academic research has been done on the place and purpose of sensitivity readers in the publishing industry since then. Articles often summarize the role of these readers and the general debate surrounding their usefulness, or explore the opinions of authors who are averse to the process. However, these articles do little to engage with the implications of their work has for the authors and readers they affect. They also rarely focus on disability. Disabled people are the largest minority group in the UK, with around 1 in 5 people reporting having a disability. However, according to a US-based 2019 study, only 3.4% of children's books have disabled main characters. And when there is disability representation in books, they often rely on stereotypes. Britain outlines the 6 pitfalls of disability fiction. 1. Portraying the character with an impairment as other than human. This is where the character is likened to vegetable matter, or links are made between the character and animals. 2. Portraying the character with an impairment as extraordinary. 3. The second fiddle phenomenon. This is where a character with an impairment is neither the central character within the narrative nor fully developed, merely serving to bring the central characters to a better understanding of themselves and disability. 4. Lack of realism and accuracy in the portrayal of the impairment. 5. The outsider. The character with an impairment is portrayed as a figure of alienation and social isolation. And 6. Happy endings. The author fails to see a happy and fulfilled life being a possibility for a character with an M. There are numerous examples of texts written by non-disabled authors that have been widely criticised for relying on stereotypes or succumbing to pitfalls such as these, including Wonder, Everything, Everything, and Me Before You. Warning here, there are spoilers ahead about these books' plot lines. In Wonder, a 10-year-old boy with a rare facial deformity starts at a new school where he is bullied, but is ultimately celebrated for being special and given an award for bravery for just being himself. In Everything, Everything, a teenage girl with an incurable severe immunodeficiency finds herself cured by the end of the novel when she discovers her mother faked her illness. And in Me Before You, a man who becomes paralysed decides to end his life via assisted suicide as he decides he does not want to live with his disability. In each case, these narratives are constructed by and for an able gaze. The character's status outside of the norm of accepted bodies and behaviours marks them as objects of revulsion or inspiration, rather than subjects with full agency and complexity. The role of the sensitivity reader is therefore not just to watch out for inaccurate depictions of disability, as these three particular books are mostly careful to avoid, but also stereotypes and harmful narrative structures that position disabled people as plot devices, often only serving a purpose to educate, inspire, or warn non-disabled characters and readers. In addition, because pictorial depictions shape our mental images of disabled bodies, visual elements of books are just as important as written ones, including illustrations and cover design. Disabled sensitivity readers interviewed for this study reported giving feedback on picture books, instruction manual illustrations, and comic books, often to look at angles, movement, motion, and aesthetic. Although it would be challenging to study the direct impact of narrow representation of disability in either the written or visual elements of books, it would not be a great leap to suggest that these representations have partly contributed to the way readers view disability in real life. A 2022 study by disability charity Scope found that half of all disabled people under the age of 55 often experienced negative attitudes and behaviours, which in turn had an impact on their confidence and their feeling of self-worth. 19% of disabled people in that study prioritised change in the media as having the biggest impact on the negative attitudes they experience. Disabled sensitivity readers could certainly have an important role in helping to produce this change. In order for their work to be effective, it is important to consider when in the editorial process a sensitivity read should take place, at ideas and character development stage, or as a final checkout proof stage. A disabled sensitivity reader interviewed for this study believes it should be early on in the process if it's something that is central to the book. It can be much later if it's a side character or small or incidental part of the book. Unfortunately, more often than not, it seems to be used as a plaster by publishers very close to publication, so it happens in a hurry, which is not the most effective way of working or a fair thing for anyone involved. It is disheartening to be called in last minute by a publisher being asked to fix what they recognise as a very problematic book by an author who doesn't want to put in the work themselves. I refuse to work on these projects. This feels like an exploitation of our lived experience where the author gets to reap the rewards. This use of a sensitivity reader as a last-minute plaster relates to publishers' recent concerns about cancel culture and pressures for publishing companies to check their content related to marginalised communities before it goes public to avoid controversy. However, employing sensitivity readers has in itself become controversial. Similar to cancel culture, the term sensitivity reader is often seen as a misnomer. As one sensitivity reader interviewed by Sky News said, "Despite the name, we're not looking for offence, we're looking for harm." A disabled sensitivity reader, Lizzie Huxley-Jones, prefers the terms authenticity reader or editorial consultancy, and Hannah Gomez, the senior editor at Kevin Anderson and Associates, prefers cultural accuracy editor. These terms move the focus away from readers' sensitivities to a more traditional editorial function of making sure a manuscript is free from inaccuracies. A focus on readers being offended, which the term sensitivity reader perhaps encourages, has the potential to delegitimise and undermine the editorial work these readers do and feeds debates which characterize this kind of work as censorship. Censorship is often viewed as a limit to freedom of expression and is defined as the action of preventing part or the whole of a book, film, work of art, document, or other kind of communication from being seen or made available to the public because it is considered offensive or harmful. All interviewees for this study were resistant to the characterization of sensitivity reads as a form of censorship. As one sensitivity reader said, "My suggestions are just that, suggestions. It is up to the author and publisher how they use them, if at all." If this work was viewed as censorship, all editorial suggestions could potentially be labelled the same. Also, even if the edits suggested by sensitivity reads are forced on authors by publishers as a condition of publication, preventing writing from being published isn't the same as censoring it. As Lawrence points out, a right to free expression of one's ideas, beliefs and feelings does not entail a positive duty on the part of publishers to promote particular instances of expression. Just as a publisher wouldn't be expected to publish a historical non-fiction work, for example, if it contained inaccuracies or was of poor quality, the argument could be made that depictions of marginalised groups in fiction should be held to the same standard. Lawrence also resists positioning sensitivity reads as primarily a means to reduce harm, which would also distance it from being characterised as censorship. From his perspective, sensitivity reads' aesthetic imperative, i.e. to help develop well-rounded, fleshed-out characters, merges with its moral one, i.e. to ensure more accurate and dignity-preserving representations of marginalised persons in literature, meaning it can be justified on aesthetic grounds without ever appealing to harm litigation. This endorses a form of aesthetic moralism, where moral flaws can become aesthetic flaws, i.e. when a work's aesthetic properties elicit incompatible sentiments that ultimately impede an artwork's aesthetic aims. So, for example, to return to an earlier book that I mentioned, the main character of Wonder being reduced to an extraordinary inspiration could undermine the book's aim in producing a fully rounded disabled character with agency in order to depict a realistic experience of disability. Here, sensitivity reading is therefore characterised as having an editorial function rather than a censoring one, aiming to improve the author's work rather than just merely reducing the risk of producing offence. These debates around censorship and cancel culture relate to a wider question of who should be allowed to tell whose stories. As one sensitivity reader interviewed for the study summarised, "My experience is that, on the whole, publishers are more comfortable publishing work about disability rather than by disabled people. My worry is that publishers could use sensitivity readers to further platform non-disabled authors over disabled ones. This is not the fault of those non-disabled authors or of sensitivity readers. It is a problem of falsely thinking disability should take up limited space in a list or one tick in a box. Sensitivity readers should be used as well as platforming disabled voices, not instead of." However, prioritising stories about disability that are written by disabled authors is also a complicated issue. The Own Voices hashtag was originally created by an author in 2015 to recommend books where the author shared the background of their characters. However, this term is now regarded by some critics as problematic, as it forces authors' private lives to become public. For example, in 2020, Becky Albertalli, author of the YA novel Simon vs. the Homo sapiens Agenda, was forced to come out as bisexual to defend her writing of a queer character. Similar scrutiny could face disabled writers if Own Voices stories are prioritised. According to a UK Parliament report published in 2023, it is estimated that 70 to 80% of disabilities are invisible, meaning it wouldn't be read immediately apparent if a particular author had a disability. This means that assessing whether a story would be considered Own Voices would be challenging, and the author would have to out themselves as disabled in order for their content to be viewed as authentic in this context. Finally, in addition to issues with diversity of authors in the industry, are issues with in-house employee diversity. Although there are no statistics on the number of disabled authors in the industry, the Publishers Association's annual workforce survey tracks the demographic makeup of the UK publishing industry. The most recent survey showed that in 2022, 16% of respondents identify as having a disability or a long-term health condition. This compares with 17.8% of the general population who are disabled as of 2021, and almost half of the UK population with a long-standing health problem in data collected from 2019 to 2020. Disabled and chronically ill people are therefore underrepresented in the industry's workforce, which could have a knock-on effect on how disabled representation is prioritised and handled. Also, where in-house employees benefit from regular work and help from HR professionals, there is very little help for freelancers such as sensitivity readers, who are usually only employed for individual projects. All interviewees for this study were not aware of any support they could access, and as one sensitivity reader summarised, even when sensitivity reading is handled in the right way, it is inevitably an exhausting and emotional line of work. Justina Ireland, the author credited with introducing the term sensitivity reader, wrote in 2018 about the exploitation and mistreatment of these readers, including not being paid for their work or being harassed online for their involvement in this process. Because of the nature of the work, it was also difficult for interviewees to envisage it becoming an in-house role that might offer more protection and a more stable income. As an agent interviewed for this study said, I would have concerns about publishers limiting this by having someone on the payroll and expecting them to have a sort of catch-all role. However, a third interviewee who works as a sensitivity reader currently said that for it to become an in-house role, publishers would have to change their attitude about us. A lot of times, people will look for a reader who fits every identity category. It wouldn't be cost-effective to keep such a wide range of people on staff. I would love a system of in-house sensitivity readers who are educated in specific areas, disability politics, queer politics, several categories of race, ethnicity, history, to be responsible for a political overview who could then hire supplementary freelance readers who have relevant lived experience. It could therefore be useful to reimagine how these readers are positioned in the publishing workforce, alongside making sure the diversity of in-house staff isn't deprioritised due to a reliance on external freelancers. There are therefore many complex issues at play in the use of disabled sensitivity readers in the publishing industry, which this presentation has only briefly introduced, and which this research will continue to explore further. Despite their clear potential to make positive change for disabled representation, their work often elicits polarising reactions and is challenging for those involved. More support is required for sensitivity readers, alongside a greater understanding of the value and nature of their work. Neary highlights the issue that publishers are sometimes using sensitivity reads purely as a risk management tool, and author Justina Ireland similarly agrees that I have seen authors, when criticised for their depictions within their books, point to sensitivity readers as a magical shield against critical analysis. Publishers therefore need to be careful to engage with this editorial process fully for the benefit of text and readers, rather than just as a PR exercise. Although they are an important tool in regulating content and reducing harm, the argument could be made that their work allows dominant voices to continue to be prioritised, while marginalised groups remain as outsiders and contracted in only when necessary. To mitigate this, there is still much work to be done to increase the number of disabled authors and staff who work in the industry, alongside increasing the number of disabled characters in books.
But I sat through one of Sophie's presentations last year, and this one is comparable. Another excellent talk. No pressure, no pressure.
This is going to be quite a different topic. So the the notion that books are different, and I'm not going to make this move every time, but I mean it, from ordinary goods and partly escape the general laws of the economy, is a common one in France, in spite of an increasingly competitive and consolidated book industry like everywhere else. If this notion is generally associated with a French cultural exception, which mainly concerns some areas of the book production, i.e. the field of restricted production, and also independent book selling, it also forms some kind of counter-model which goes well beyond French borders, as I would like to show today. The revival of independent bookshops in recent years provides a good illustration of the books are different principle, as these bookshops are associated with a supposedly more authentic and personal service than other forms of retail, mainly Amazon and book chains, of course. A service that is supposedly, again, more attuned to the special status of books than the one provided by big transnational companies. So the study I have been conducting in France and Britain aims to shed light on the imaginary surrounding books in independent bookshops in both countries, in order to try and understand the circulation of alternative representations of the business of books in two contrasting settings. Although bookshops on both sides of the channel operate in very different legal and economic contexts since the end of the Net Book Agreement in 1995, they express astonishingly similar views of their trade. Just very briefly, the study relies on more than 50 interviews with the owners of small to medium-sized independent bookshops created between the mid-1990s up to today, together with interviews with representatives of trade bodies and cultural policy makers. I also specify that the selection of bookshops in France is more varied than the one in Britain due to COVID restrictions. I couldn't go everywhere in the UK, so it covers the whole of France, and in the UK it's the Greater London area, so I'm quite aware of a strong bias here, even though it's quite obvious that the revival of independent bookshops in the UK is by no means limited to the London area. So in order to make sense of this imaginary surrounding books in French and British bookshops, I will first address the recent process leading to the notion that books are different in both countries, before looking very briefly at media coverage of book retail, which echoes this imaginary in interesting ways. And I'll finish, if I have enough time, by looking into some of the constitutive traits of the alternative values supposedly held by independent bookshops. So first, the books are different principle in retail. How did it all begin? According to the political scientist Yves Surel, the notion that books are different has significant cognitive and normative power in France. He compares it to a matrix. I'm not sure it works in English, it works in French, but I'll just leave it to you. So of course it's difficult to understand how this power came into being without mentioning the 1981 Loi Langue, the Langue law on establishing a fixed price for books. And this law has provided the framework for the whole book ecosystem until today. Establishing a fixed price for books with a maximum discount of 5% enshrined, so to speak, a cultural and qualitative vision of the book trade. And what is interesting is that it linked booksellers' activities to the Ministry of Culture, whereas it used to be the Ministry of Trade before that. And also interesting is to look at, to see that that shift was mainly supported by a new generation of booksellers, younger ones, with different sociological profiles, who were calling for greater state intervention in the name of the specific nature of books, of course due to their symbolic content. It is worth quoting the words of Jack Lang, the Minister for Culture of the time, in the Senate House in 1981, because these words are often quoted in France. So books are not a product like any other. They are a creation of the mind, one of the noblest creations of the spirit and the imagination, and as such, they cannot be subjected to the sole law of the market without special protection. I know it's a very French conception, I apologize for that. So this was a break from the traditionally hands-off approach to book policy in France, because before that it wasn't the case at all. It can be explained by the evolution of the publishing sector from the 1970s onwards, when three major groups representing almost 2/3 of publishing sales, among which Hachette, were formed. So at the time, smaller players mobilized to defend a certain book economy where literary works and quality essays would be given a chance alongside bestsellers and brand author titles. But the majority of publishers and large bookshops at the time were hostile to government intervention, and it was a long and arduous process. The Loi Lang paved the way for a new kind of bookshops, as I was mentioning, of bookshop managers, who made culture a key part of their plan. So it's really, we need to keep in mind the fact that, of course, they wanted to run a business and they wanted their business to be profitable, but they always had this sort of dual conception that it was also a way of promoting cultural diversity and trying to appeal to the widest possible audience. Generally, they wanted to provide some kind of public service. I mean, it is an expression that is often used, as much as making a living through the selling of books. And to quote one of quite old today bookshop manager who remembered what it was like in the 1980s, he's saying, at the time, being an independent bookshop also meant being independent of commerce or trade, so it was a really strong notion at the time. So what was their profile? In what way was their profile different from their predecessors? Well, they were generally more educated, very high degrees in general. Some were politically engaged, and their shops had little in common with the traditional and elitist kind of bookshop of the 50s and 70s. From the 1980s onwards, against a backdrop of growing consolidation in the industry, public authorities began to see bookshops as an essential vehicle for providing access to culture. Various support schemes were put in place at the national and regional level, both public and private. And the underlying idea was that, and I'm going to quote here an official from the Ministry of Culture that I recently interviewed, it's this idea that the diversity of bookshop guarantees the diversity of books that are being offered. So today, the land law is widely supported in France, supermarkets and book chains included. And even though independent bookshops' market share has strongly declined from about 50% at the time of the Loi Lang to 19% today, the country can boast an impressive network of about 2,400 bookshops. I mean, there are different ways of counting that, not including book chains, of course. And maybe more importantly, 50 to 100 new shops open each year, thus reinforcing the consensus around book retail's exceptional status. But of course, the idea that books are not commodities like any others didn't originate in France. It's like the French Revolution, the English did it before. It originated in the UK. It can be traced to the 1890s, when the publisher Frederick Macmillan campaigned for a system of price regulation designed to protect the less commercial parts of production. And Great Britain is indeed the first country to have adopted, as far as I know, a single price system for books in 1900, as the Net Book Agreement was designed to protect publishers and booksellers alike from price competition. The system allowed for a very modern balance to be struck between commercial and cultural considerations, and it particularly protected the small independent bookshops that dominated the sector until the mid-1980s. So what is interesting, I'm just trying to move on, what is interesting to note when we compare both countries is that the same context of economic concentration of the 80s and 90s has had completely opposite effects in the two countries. It has led to the adoption of a single price mechanism guaranteed by the state in France, which has one big disadvantage that sometimes people don't realize, is that booksellers are completely dependent on publishers. Publishers control their margins, but it has ensured their survival. And by contrast, in Great Britain, it has brought about the abandonment of a secular system of protection, almost condemning independent bookshops to extinction in the early 2000s as they faced competition from supermarkets and Amazon. So obviously the global nature of the publishing sector in the UK and the dominance of the English language worldwide is a key factor in explaining this difference, together with very contrasting conceptions of state intervention in France and Britain. However, the idea that books are different didn't go away with the Net Book Agreement in the UK, and I hope my English colleagues can maybe give some more information about this. And I think the revival of independent bookshops up and down the country testifies to this. According to the Booksellers Association, the number of independent bookshops began to pick up in 2017 after 22 years of cumulative decline, and their number was at its highest in 2022, with more than 1,000 bookshops and 54 new ones. So as their French counterparts, these new booksellers have emphasized selection and recommendation, as well as put forward their economic and cultural contribution to local life and communities well beyond their retail function. So it's interesting, we sort of find the same kind of vision behind bookshops. Of course, the reason for their revival is that they stopped competing on price. I'll just give a very quick overview of some interviews, extracts. So the first one is a bookshop in Islington, and I like the idea that books are luxury goods. And the second one is another bookshop in the south of London. And I think the last bit of the quote is interesting when he says that it's about being practical. It's not being sentimental, it's being practical. And just an echo in Paris of a similar, if a bit larger bookshop. So where Amazon is seen as something positive that actually helped the shop. So I think I'm running out of time, so my
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I'll just skip very quickly to media coverage because it's interesting to see. So I surveyed 6 different dailies in France between 2000 and 2020, and you could really see a sort of shift in 2010. Before that, it was always sort of disaster, you know, it's sort of species on the brink of extinction. And after 2010, it became much more positive and aggressive in a way, like we have to fight back and it's worth doing it. And I did the same in only The Guardian, so it's limited once again to a smaller sample. But here the time shift is a bit further. It's 2017, but you can really see from the, just looking at the titles, and I only took a very few examples, I have dozens of them. You can really see a change of tone in the way bookshops are represented, and it's something I talked about last year. The bias, the way journalists envision retail, book retail, it's always the independent, the nice and sweet independent bookshop, as opposed to Amazon or the inhuman and big book chain. So it's also an interesting point. So I'll just very quickly, two things that I wanted to broach in my last part in terms of alternative values. The first one was the bookshop as the place where you can resist some trends of modern, digitized world, where we all with our mobile phones and sort of like go back to the real world and forget about it all, and like a bubble. So this is an example taken from a bookshop in Norwich called, can't remember what it's called, the Book Hive, sorry. And the other trait I wanted to talk about was this really paradoxical notion that bookshops are not places of commerce. They're not, as if they were not businesses, like businesses without business is a way of showing this. And of course it's a show, of course it's the way booksellers talk about their business, but I can't think of other retail where people would say things like that, like customers are friends and we don't push them to, it's okay if they don't buy, it's fine, we don't mind, etc., etc. I particularly like this quote, so I'll just leave it for you to ponder. And as a conclusion, I wanted to maybe stress the fact that looking at book retail in two very different countries like France and Great Britain in the recent period shows that independent bookshops have first followed an almost opposite trajectory in order to converge again today. And the revival of physical bookshops, particularly in their most cultural expression. Of course, there are other forms of retail. I'm not, pretending they don't exist. It's interesting to see that, notwithstanding very different cultural backgrounds and conditions of, business, they share the same rhetoric. Probably because they have similar sociological profile and similar clientele. But this is something we can leave aside. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for being
You were spot on time. Well done. Thank you very much. I have to say, I love a panel where when you come in, it sounds like there are two things that have nothing in common. But then you start listening to them, there's so many different ways that these two talks overlap and interact. So are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
I actually have a question for each, if that's okay, and they're not really related. And they're also going to, I hope this isn't the case, but I'm very sympathetic to both of your presentations, but these questions might come off as a little bit aggressive, but I hope you take them in the spirit. My first question for Kat is, the pitfalls that you have that slide of the pitfalls. And I guess my reaction to seeing those was that it seems maybe like trying to avoid those pitfalls is recentering maybe this sort of like very European Enlightenment idea of a human or a character, right? It's sort of very Bildungsroman, like, the happy ending, the character who is neither a vegetable, animal, nor machine. And I mean, I'm not a disability studies scholar, but my understanding is that a lot of disability studies sort of tries to decenter that idea of the European Enlightenment idea of the human. And so I'm wondering maybe if the sensitivity readers, if they're trying to redirect from these pitfalls, are reinforcing a norm that maybe shouldn't be reinforced, or maybe, would, I don't know. I'll leave that question there. And my other question for Sophie was, I wonder, I read recently Caroline Kogla and Corinna Norrie-Clues, the Our Book Still Different? I don't know if you've read that. But they're looking mainly at the German context, and I think they would agree with you that the imaginary of the Our Book Still Different exists in Germany, but they question sort of whether it actually exists in practice, right? Whether the protection of books in the way that you describe has led to the diversity. So, for example, the quote, "The diversity of bookshops is the guarantee of cultural diversity," is what they're sort of questioning. So I'm wondering if that's part of your research at all, if you find that the protection of bookshops actually achieves what it is meant to achieve.
Yeah. Thank you. That is really interesting. That's such an interesting point. I think it sort of, to me, talks to how much we expect sensitivity readers to be experts in those sorts of things. Because I think, thinking to the sensitivity readers I interviewed with the study, they certainly aren't disability scholars. They're people with lived experience. And so I don't think they'd be having those kind of ideas in mind when they're reading these books. They'd just be thinking, how would my community like practically to be represented? And it often isn't in those ways that I discussed on the screen. So yeah, it would be really interesting to consider from that more academic perspective, I guess. And yeah, it's a question of whether or not sensitivity readers should have that kind of training or background to be able to do this kind of work, because that is a criticism sometimes of the process.
Thank you as well. It wasn't, I didn't feel aggressive at all.
Sorry,
I felt a bit worried when you said that.
Like, you started with, books are different, and I was like, well, our book's still different, our book's different.
No, it's an ongoing question, and I mean, officials and people in the industry are always questioning this notion. So no, it's really. I haven't read it yet, the you're mentioning, but I have to. There is a very strong consensus in France. It's like one of the very few political things that all parties across the political spectrum agree on. I think the law is like a sacred thing. Nobody can touch it. And also lots of studies have been carried out, and they all show that it has made a huge difference. And the comparison with the UK is always is often mentioned. And when I interviewed people in the UK, they would always say, "Oh, you're so lucky in France because you have this, and we are in a completely different situation." And it's just. But also another element, I think, is what happened during COVID-19. There was, the way bookshops were celebrated during lockdown was absolutely stunning, and to the point that it became a national obsession. I think it was fairly the same in Belgium, and we actually copied the Belgium system with the fact that now bookshops are considered essential retail. So if there's another lockdown, they won't have to close down. They will have to remain open. And their market share has really, after COVID and for the whole year after COVID restrictions, they've really made a lot of, they did extremely well, and it lasted. It wasn't only for 3 months. People like doing this in order to show that they cared for their bookshop. There are lots of interesting forces at play at the moment around this idea. So it's always in danger. It's always something that people are books really different. But as COVID has very recently showed, it seems that at least the answer at most levels of society is yes, they are different, and we want them to be different, which is slightly different.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
This is also me. Thank you. I found your talk heartening and very disheartening as an Australian, because we really struggle to balance the commercial with the cultural, especially in publishing. And I put that down to our very heinous copyright laws with really non-robust moral rights protections in particular. And I was just wondering, to what extent do you think the French moral rights in copyright law, overarching laws, really underpin this government support? Because I know that you see the connection of the individual to their creative output very differently to how we, and possibly in the UK as well, I would say. I don't know, maybe that's a question you can't answer, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a very interesting point. I had never thought about it, I could maybe answer at two levels. The first one is, yes, it's true, we have a different system from the copyright system in France, and it has two bits. One bit is the moral protection of authors' work, so you cannot change anything, whether for books or films or all cultural productions. They cannot be altered without the author's consent, and this is very strong, and it's always highlighted as being very different from the Anglo-Saxon model, the copyright model. And then you have the more commercial part of it, which is, I think, similar to, fairly similar. The only thing is, I'm not sure it would, even though it's a very strong point, I'm not sure it would work for bookshops, because it has to do with the vision of the author. And bookshops came late in the process. They were the last ones to be protected by the ministry, because they were considered as shops, and shops don't, they are a bit despised. It's not the higher cultural conception and production. So authors first, then publishers, then bookshops came into the sort of.
It's just the way you were speaking this, like dialogue of support. It's like language that we don't hear. You don't get that. The burden is always on publishers and the booksellers to fix these problems, and there's never any intervention from government.
It's a very strong, today at least, it wasn't always the case, but for the past maybe 15 years, it's a very strong interprofessional thing. Like publishers realized about 20 years ago that bookshops were an essential part of what we call the book chain, and that they were the weakest element of the book chain. And if they weren't protected, there would be knock-on effects. Like a big publisher like Gallimard, for instance, relies on independent bookshops for more than 50% of its turnover. It's huge, it's massive. If independent bookshops vanish, publishers like Gallimard will really have problems, even though of course they have books in supermarkets, in book chains, but they need the sort of impetus that is given by bookshop, especially for new authors. Authors nobody knows. There are lots of big successes in fiction that can be put down to independent bookshops, because also independent bookshops are one of the few cultural intermediaries that are still respected in France, as opposed to book critics, for instance. The bookseller is, people trust them, so they make a difference for certain bits of literature. I don't think that for the presentation we had this morning on Bookscan, it wouldn't work. I mean, it's completely different bits of the market. Maybe you wanted to say something about that.
My name is Helge Running. I'm from the University of Oslo, and together with my colleague sitting here, we have made a comparative analysis of literary policies around the world. And I think the issue of moral rights in relation to authors' rights, I prefer to call it authors' rights legislation, rather than copyright legislation, because I come from the continental European tradition, where it is about authors' rights primarily, secondly about copyright. While in the Anglo-American tradition, it's first and foremost commercial right, that is a copyright, secondly an author's right. And that's a very important distinction. And that means that also in relation to the sale of books, and I think this is an underlying part of the loi langue, that it's not only to defend and promote reading, but it's also to defend and promote writing. So authors are part of the loi langue perspective. But secondly, and that's why I want to make this comparison, that's in relation to sensitivity readers. Authors in Norway have reacted very strongly against this because they think it's an infringement on their authors and moral rights. And it is a question of whether it is possible to have sensitivity readers on classicals that are still not in the free, for instance, because it will infringe on the moral rights of the author. And I think it's a very essential issue, because your answers that we got did not mention authors' rights at all. And this is very, very important in this context.
Just a short comment on that. In Sweden, that's the case as well, but not only authors, even critics and academics. So it was this Roald Dahl issue coming up, and there was a huge debate that several editors and critics wrote debates, articles about that.
That's such an interesting point. Thank you for raising it. That's something I hadn't really thought about and definitely going to think about more. I think it sort of relates back to that idea of sensitivity readers as just a normal editorial function. Though of course it's become, people become more enraged about it because it's linking to ideas of rituals and censorship. So that idea of the kind of moral right to integrity, about sort of protecting an author's work and making sure it isn't edited beyond their control, that sort of covers making the work worse. There's certainly in UK law, I don't know exactly in other countries. So if you consider a sensitivity reader improving a work and making the depictions of characters more accurate, that wouldn't necessarily be going against the author's right of integrity. But it's also about the collaboration with the author and how much they feel like there's kind of their consent is involved in the process. So when I was kind of interviewing sensitivity readers, they were saying, I've never had a problem with an author being angry about it. Actually, they approached me. They asked their publishers to come to me about it. Whereas there are probably lots of other authors who wouldn't feel so comfortable with the process. They would feel like their words were sort of being taken from their control. So yeah, that's definitely something I want to investigate more. That's very interesting.
Two absolutely fascinating papers. Questions for you, Sophie. I was intrigued by sort of two concepts. The suggestion about books being sort of luxury goods like cashmere scarves. Tying that in with the idea of sort of a diversity of bookshops, in, making possible a diversity of books, and where the diversity of readers fits into this. Because if sort of the UK and France have sort of have converged through some very different routes, one might expect that the cuts in prices in UK books and being sold in supermarkets, etc., would lead potentially to an increase in readership in sort of lower socioeconomic groups. And I was wondering whether you're aware of any research, whether you've done this yourself, looking at sort of whether there's been more diversity in readership in either country as a result of this work. So that's a very rambling question.
I think, of course, for this presentation, I tended to leave some things on the side, so a bit of nuance was left out. There are some differences, and a major one is I don't think a French bookseller would say books are luxury goods, because there is no price competition, so it wouldn't make any sense. I thought it was really interesting that this particular bookseller in London would use this cashmere scarf image. So that would be a difference. And I think the fact that bookshops, independent bookshops, stopped competing on price, and Waterstones did as well, because they really at some point emulated the independent model, and they James Daunt made a theory out of it. So there is a difference here. I mean, the fact that you can compete on price in the UK inevitably leads to the fact that if you don't compete on price, if you never discount books, then they are a bit of a luxury good, and you attract even more sociologically specific kind of clientele. And it would be wonderful to have some data about this. I don't know if the Booksellers Association would consider doing this. Apparently they spend, they give more attention to independent bookshops today than, when I started working on this, they didn't even, of course they knew what an independent bookshop was, but they didn't have any figures. So when I came to them saying, do you know roughly, how many independent bookshops there are in the UK? They were like, what is she talking about? And it's just, yeah, there are physical bookshops and, Amazon online retail, but who cares about it? The polarization was between online only and physical bookshops, and it has changed. Now they have figures, and now they communicate about these figures, but this is really new. So that's a big difference, I think. But I'd love to have some data about this. The ones we have in France tend to show that, of course, people who go to independent bookshops tend to be sociologically, slightly more educated with economic and cultural capital. Not because it's more expensive, because it's not the case, but because bookshops can be intimidating. Lots of people just would never go to a bookshop. They feel terrified. They feel judged. So and I can understand this. They like going to supermarkets. Nobody's asking them any questions. They love going to the Fnac book chain or any other book chain because it's a neutral place. So what we tend to idealize about independent bookshops can be a foil for lots of people. So, yeah.
If books aren't different, then they're not scary. That if you can buy books in a supermarket alongside everything else, they're not exclusionary, but they're also they're not different. So
exactly. So I think it's really good to have a sort of balanced network of retail. It would be terrifying if it was only independent bookshops. Lots of people would probably be excluded from it. They would never buy children's books, or so it's important.
Thank you so much.
Let's talk about one last question, and then we'll finish off.
Thank you. I'm Beth LaRue from the University of Victoria. I actually want to follow up very much on that question as well, because just what you've been saying right now at the end, if you want to imagine a case where there are no big chains and supermarkets do not sell books, then South Africa is a lovely case study for you. Even our chain, Exclusive Books, literally has the name exclusive, is considered highly exclusionary and extremely intimidating for ordinary people. So books are considered luxury goods, and during COVID they were not considered essential items. They were really very specific limited items that you could buy whether from online or from physical shops. So in that kind of case, it's really hard to see that people see books as different because they see something that it's something they do not need. And it's something that they would not be spending money on because books are for school or for university, or as looking at, it was a little embarrassing actually, looking at those figures, and that from the book scan figures, because our top sellers are kind of dictionaries and the K53 manual for drivers. So it shows you that people are buying books just for a specific purpose. It would mean you would get, there is certainly a very small elitist group that do see books as something essential that they would have to buy, but they are really that tiny elitist group that would go to independent bookshops anyway, probably. So it's just so interesting to hear that there's a different discourse, where in our country there's a single discourse really around that. There's the elitist one, but the widespread discourse is the difference.
But it's an elitist vision in France too. I mean, don't make mistakes. I mean, it's not, you know, if you look at the top 10 bestsellers in France, they are very, very, I mean, they're very similar to, I mean, France wasn't in the countries that Andre presented this morning, but it would be very similar. You would have cooking books and maybe it's a slightly bigger portion of the population that needs and likes to read, you know, literature for leisure, but don't worry. I mean, it's don't get it wrong. France is not this incredible country where people love, you know, read schools on the metro. I mean, that's really not. But I was just wondering, are books expensive in South Africa? Yeah. Okay.
Also because so many of them are imported, and the exchange rate is terrible, and then we have tax on
So
books.
that-
So
yeah.
there's the ordinary tax you have on all products is on books as well. So they are expensive.
So it would be similar to some countries in South America, Chile, for instance, where books are really luxury goods because they're so expensive. It's like a month's salary to buy. You know, so very few people can afford to buy them.
Right. Well,
Some